Let me talk about the topic a little bit. This is a really hot topic, nutrition and cancer. It's amazing how few people realize that food is related to risk of cancer. They've done surveys looking at, louder? Maybe if I hold it like that? That's better? Okay. They've done surveys where asking people, what's related to cancer? Is food related to cancer? And very few people realize that food is actually related to cancer risk. It's surprising to me based on the science. And so this is a bit of there's some ideas in here that are, by mainstream thought, are almost a little fringe in a way. I mean, it's kind of going out there a little bit to talk about nutrition and cancer. A little bit, not really, but nonetheless, there's a depth of evidence. So what I want to do today is talk about how the food we eat is likely to be related to cancer. And I'm going to talk about 3 different types of evidence to explain why food is related to cancer. One is observational research. When you start any sort of scientific investigation, oftentimes you start with an observational question. You start with observations. Who gets cancer? Who doesn't? What's different between them? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about mechanisms. Is it possible, and how is it possible that food is related to cancer risk? And then we're going to go for the linchpin and go and look at some intervention studies where diet actually changes the course of cancer in living creatures. A quick sidebar, I forgot to mention, we are recording this so that our goal is to get it up online for people to watch it later too. I have some conflicts of interest that all academic lectures, you should identify conflicts of interest. Oh, that was what I forgot. That's what I forgot. Not my conflicts of interest, we have some door prizes, so stick around till the end. I knew there was something. We have door prizes. We have a nice bottle of F. Oliver's Special Reserve balsamic vinegar, and we also have a hardcover copy that I donated, it's not bought, of the Campbell Plan that I will sign for people. So we have 2 nice door prizes, so stick around to the end. We'll do that at the end. Conflicts of interest, I do get royalties from general interest books on nutrition and some travel and reimbursement for lectures. So let's start with observational research on diet and cancer. If you go back through time, 50, 60 years ago, when we first started looking at populations that get cancer and populations that don't get cancer, it's pretty clear that some types of cancers are sort of quote-unquote Western cancers. These are things like colon cancer, for example. Colon cancer has long been known to be much more common in Western countries, more affluent, more developed countries. So what you're looking at here is a graph of colon cancer and meat intake. And the more meat, the more colon cancer. And this is a very strong relationship, as it turns out. In fact, this is not even that much meat. This is in grams of meat. So this is less than, in most of these countries are less than a pound of, well less, they're all under a pound of meat. So 454 grams is a pound, right? So we're talking here, this is all within countries, the average daily intake of maybe half a pound of meat. This is in a low range of meat intake and a very strong relationship with colon cancer. Here's kidney cancer and animal protein intake. Again, the higher the animal protein, the higher the kidney cancer, a strong relationship. Here's non-fat milk consumption and prostate cancer mortality. So the more milk in a population, the higher the rate of death of prostate cancer. Strong relationship. Here's cheese consumption and testicular cancer. Here's meat intake and breast cancer. Here's milk consumption and ovarian cancer. Milk consumption and uterine cancer or endometrial cancer. Populations consuming more of these foods, striking relationship with these different cancers. Milk consumption and breast cancer. So it seems that there are some cancers that are more common in Western countries. And realize that these cancers that ravage us, breast cancer, colorectal cancer, prostate cancer, anybody know anybody with these cancers? They are very common. And they are much higher in developed countries. Okay, that's the first lesson from this research. You can't prove anything from these relationships. These relationships, to be honest, are kind of crude. They're based on kind of crude population data. I'm not suggesting we know there's causation here, but you can say from this data, these cancers are more common in Western countries. So realize that not everybody around the world has the rate of breast cancer that Americans do. It's not just sort of random. There's some populations that are somehow spared. So this is an interesting idea. If they're spared, why are they spared? And let's just look at another comparison in this type of data. This is lung cancer and tobacco consumption. So everybody knows that smoking causes lung cancer. And if you look at population studies, you see a strong relationship between tobacco consumption and lung cancer. This looks kind of like those last few graphs I showed you, right? So cancer is localized. Cancer is localized. This is a big shift. That fact alone is a big shift for a lot of people. A lot of people think it's just random. It's just aging. But if cancer is localized, then there's something about the environment, right? And this adds to that argument. If you take someone living in a low-risk area, what you're looking at in this graph is a risk of breast cancer mortality in different countries, ranging from Japan to the more Western countries in the UK in the 1960s. If women from Japan migrate to the US or some other more Western, typically Western country with Western diet and lifestyle, what happens to their risk of cancer? They came from a place where breast cancer was relatively rare. 15% of what it is for women here. What happens when they move? They adopt the risk of the population to which they move, depending on how long they have in that country. So in breast cancer, if you move from Japan to the LA County early in life, you have a higher risk of breast cancer than if you stayed in Japan. If you move even later in life, you have a higher risk of breast cancer than if you stayed in Japan. So moving is dangerous. And it becomes more compelling when you see in all these migrant studies in general, subsequent generations have higher and higher risk. So even if it's not that strong in the people who move, their kids, if they are born in the US and they grow up fully in the culture, their risk of these cancers, now you really begin to approach sort of the white native population. So there's something in the environment. If cancer is localized and you can change your risk just by moving to different locales, there's something about the environment that's playing a role, right? It's not, yes, genes matter. We know genes matter, but there's something about the environment. So what is it? Is it smoke? Is it pollution, from cars, from traffic? Is it pesticides? Is it exercise, moving from a high exercise area to low exercise? Is it the diet? Is it sugar? What is it in the diet? There's all sorts of questions and hypotheses, but we've now established a very important, interesting idea. There's something in the environment that matters. This is a big idea, it turns out, that a lot of people haven't quite gotten there yet. In fact, in 1981, Sir Richard Dahl and Sir Richard Peto, two leading researchers in the world who are in part responsible for sort of exposing the harms of tobacco and making those well known, were asked to do a report for U.S. Congress asking them what causes cancer. Based on our current research, what causes cancer? And they did this in 1981, and they looked at all the different potential causes of cancer. They looked at observational research, the localization of cancer, what happens in migrant studies, this type of thing. And they said in 1981 that 75 to 80% of all U.S. cancers are avoidable. If we just knew all of the right environmental and protective factors, if we could just do that and put those all in place, maybe as much as 75 to 80% of U.S. cancers are avoidable. That is a huge number, a huge number. Even if we're anywhere close to true, that's a big number. Even, again, this idea of genes, this idea that it's all genetic. Clearly, genes are powerful, and they do, in some cases, have the driving influence. But less than people would like to think, less than is commonly perceived. Genes matter less than is commonly perceived. Even the American Cancer Society, which is, I would call, a fairly conservative sort of mainstream organization, if you looked on their website, at least in the past few years, they say that 5 to 10% of all cancers are inherited, due strictly to what's called highly penetrant, sort of strong genes. Only 5 to 10% of all cancers are due strictly to genes. Those are things like the BRCA genes, Lynch syndrome, other types of very strong genetic syndromes that just give you a striking predisposition to cancer. But most cancers are not that. So what is the cause of cancer? And according to this report, percent of all cancer deaths, what would you guess? Most people know tobacco is up there, particularly with lung cancer. Tobacco is bad for many cancers. They estimated that maybe 30% of all cancer deaths are due to tobacco. Diet, they said, was 35%. As much as 35% of all cancer are due to diet. And they found studies, estimates ranging from anywhere from 10% of all cancer up to 70% of all cancers potentially related to diet. Alcohol, another few percent, which we'll talk about later. Infection causes cancer. Infection, things like HPV virus. I don't know if you saw the headlines recently, but something like 50% of all Americans have been affected by dangerous strains of HPV, which can cause cancer, cervical cancer, and other types of cancer. Hepatitis can cause cancer. So infection causes cancer. Reproductive factors, these are things like if a woman has, how many kids a woman has, how old she is when she has her first children, whether she breastfeeds or not. These are all related to hormone levels and hormone production in the body, and they affect cancer risk. How about pollution, additives, medicine, imaging, occupation, geophysical factors, things like radon? A couple percent of each. When we think about environmental determinants of cancer, most of the time people are very concerned about things like preservatives in the food, pesticides on the farm. And I'm not for those things. I'm not for car exhaust. But that contribution to cancer is likely very small compared to the actual nutrition, the actual food that you eat, the nutrients found in the food that you eat. So again, going back to this idea that food is linked to cancer. I've shown you just a brief sample of observation research. So now we have a hypothesis. We can make a hypothesis. We can say, okay, well, perhaps diets low in meat and dairy, based on those graphs, perhaps diets low in meat and dairy are protective against cancer. Now we have to test it. And we have to see what are the mechanisms? If this is true, how would it work? And if we can start to put these pieces together, we can create a compelling argument that nutrition and this type of nutrition is likely to be good for cancer. So this is mechanisms, and this could be a 2-year course, but I'm going to focus on breast cancer a little bit because we're going to hopefully do some research on breast cancer. We are doing research on breast cancer. These are some of the mediators of risk of breast cancer. So these things have all been studied, and when these things are present, we know it influences the risk of breast cancer. This is things like the metabolic syndrome. If you have metabolic syndrome, that's kind of like a diabetes picture, you have a higher risk of breast cancer. If you have high serum insulin levels, if you have higher risk breast cancer, certain growth factors like IGF-1, high risk cancer. high levels of hormones, high levels of serum estrogen, estrogens in your blood, or even the male hormones, androgens, things like testosterone in your blood, that affects risk of breast cancer. Not exercising affects risk of breast cancer. Inflammation, general inflammation has been found to be a risk factor. Body weight, a strong risk factor. Alcohol and Western diet. And when you look at these particular constellation of factors, it's very interesting because in my mind, I look at these and I think, well, gosh, there's actually see three mediators here. I see the Western diet, alcohol, and sedentary activity that then in turn determine the rest of these factors. So maybe mediators include Western diet, alcohol, and inactivity based on this. And let me explain that, why I'm saying, let me prove it to you. Let's start with just hormone levels, growth factors, and insulin. Three of the things that we know are risks for breast cancer. Okay? This was a study in humans done at the Pritikin Center, published in 2006 in a Nutrition and Cancer journal, good peer-reviewed journal. They took 38 postmenopausal women who were overweight or obese. So these women did not have cancer to start. They were just overweight. And for 2 weeks, that's it, 14 days, 2 weeks, for the blink of an eye, they put them on their lifestyle program, very similar to what we do in our program. For 2 weeks, they had a plant-based diet, and this was at a very nice, fancy residential program. So it's kind of like a super nice jail. You know, free living people are nothing but trouble. So you do good research, you put people in a jail. This is a very nice residential program. So people were doing what they were supposed to do. They were provided with as much as they wanted. They could eat as much as they want, but only if the food provided. They got a very low-fat diet. So a diet with essentially no added fats. They got average amount of protein. They got a very high carbohydrate diet, but it was carbohydrate with a lot of fiber. So these were healthy carbohydrates. These were things like sweet potatoes. If it was a grain, it was a whole grain. These were things like beans, fruits, vegetables. These things are high carbohydrate, but they have a lot of fiber. So it was unprocessed plant foods with a lot of fiber, and they could eat as much as they wanted to. And there was also some moderate exercise. They also encouraged these. They developed a very mild sort of exercise program, mostly walking in the Pritikin Center studies, just walking some every day. So what happened in 14 days? Probably nothing much, right? 14 days, what could happen in 14 days? I wouldn't be telling you, obviously, if there wasn't something that happened. Yes, it's true, nothing happened. Let's move on. I failed. No, it turns out in 14 days they took blood samples at the beginning and end. In just 14 measly, lousy days in these women, estradiol, that's estrogen, decreased by over a third. Estrogen levels decreased over a third. This was, by the way, this is not because of the estrogen or hormones they pump into the milk. A lot of people think that it's related to hormones that are added to the foods. It's actually not about that. It's actually about what your body makes, how much estrogen your body makes. Your body makes less estrogen if you change the nutrition. Postmenopausal women who should have a relatively more even level of estrogen. So estrogen decreased by over a third. IGF-1, this is one of the growth factors that's known to be a risk factor for breast cancer, and IGF-1 decreased almost 20%. IGF binding protein, which is, I won't get into, but that went up. That's a good thing. That's all I'll say about that. Insulin levels, again, related to metabolic syndrome and metabolic health, diabetes, insulin levels decreased 29% in 14 days. Now, in 14 days, they also lost a couple pounds, but not that much. These changes were not because they lost 3 pounds. In overweight, obese women. They lost 3 pounds. That doesn't lower your estrogen by 30%. So this is a very profound finding from my point of view. All of these things are risk factors for breast cancer. So we've crossed off some. I'm not going to show you, this is a brief presentation, I'm not going to show you the androgens. There's studies showing that a similar kind of intervention can actually lower testosterone levels in women, which is a risk factor for breast cancer. Let's talk about metabolic health. This was 15 postmenopausal women with obesity. And actually, they were pretty healthy to begin with, so they didn't have diabetes, they didn't have major metabolic problems. They just had abdominal obesity. They carried around their waist. And they did a very interesting study for 4 weeks. They had these women eat a high-protein diet with soy protein. What does that mean? It means that they had a sort of a standard diet, but they took out the meat, not all of it, but they took out most of the meat and they replaced it with soy analogs, soy fake meats, soy protein products. They took out the meat, they replaced it with soy. Everything else they kept the same. So they've actually gave the people with soy, because they're eating less meat, they actually had to supplement them with saturated fat to keep the diet the same. So they supplemented the soy people with saturated. Everything else they kept the same. And then they measured a whole bunch of things at the beginning and end, and then they went home. They did sort of a washout period, go back to life, and then come back, and we'll give you another 4-week intervention. And this time they did a 4-week intervention, but it was a high-protein animal-based diet. So it was kind of like a typical high-protein diet with plenty of meat, plenty of milk, plenty of cheese, plenty of eggs, in a sort of a typical American diet. And they compared, what happened to these people on each diet. And very interestingly and impressively, insulin sensitivity, how well the insulin works. This is a fundamental aspect of diabetes, prediabetes, and metabolic syndrome. Insulin worked about 55% better on the soybean diet. When I read this study, I have to say I was actually very surprised, because they weren't changing all of the diet. This wasn't a very comprehensive diet change. It was just taking out meat and putting in some soy foods. And they found that insulin sensitivity was 55% higher on a soy diet. The glucose disposal is related. The bodies were more efficient at using glucose. Cholesterol was down a little bit. And inflammation decreased. This was not statistically significant, but it was a big trend. Inflammation decreased on the soy diet by 50%. So women who replaced their meat with soy had a 50% decrease in inflammation, systemic inflammation. Wow, that's a big number. Again, small group of people, not statistically significant, but big number. So metabolic syndrome, inflammation, and there's just reams of research on how diet can improve metabolic syndrome that I'm not going to share. So we're left with body weight and BMI, and just as an example here, we've done in the past a 14-day program where we give people 14 days of Kitchen Verde food, and you can either get your lunches and dinners or breakfast, lunches, and dinners for $50 extra or something, and we do biometric testing at the beginning and end, just simple biometric testing. It's not a research study. It's lipid panel, glucose, weights, blood pressures. We've had 32 people go through, most of whom are overweight. It's very strict. It's strict 100%. This isn't sort of a partway thing. It's 100%. People can eat as much as they want, but it has to be 100% whole food, plant-based, no meat, dairy, eggs, added fats, and very little processed foods, if any. And people lose, on average, over 4 pounds in 14 days. Cholesterol drops 17% total, and LDL cholesterol dropped 27% in 14 days. So now we've got weight loss, and this is eating. There was just a study that came out within the past month or two showing that, in free-living people, this type of diet without calorie restriction or portion control resulted in significant weight loss, like over 20 pounds in the course of 6-month study, which is the largest, they noted was the largest weight loss ever shown in a study without calorie restriction or mandatory exercise. So this is pretty good for nutrition affects body weight. You all knew that. And these are just a few of the mechanisms, and this is where we could veer off into a 5-year conversation about other mechanisms, but there's a lot of other ways that food affects cancer, and I'll just mention some that have been studied. Lignans, these are chemicals, food chemicals. They're types of phytoestrogens or phytochemicals. They're high in flaxseed. They have been shown in many studies to affect cancer, in vitro in experimental animal research, also in test tube type studies. They increase apoptosis, that's cell death. Cancer is killing themselves off. Lignans can affect whether cancers kill themselves off in some models. They reduce cell proliferation. So they stop cells from dividing, good thing in cancer. They stop angiogenesis, dysregulated blood vessel growth. Phytic acid in nuts, grains, and seeds have been shown to reduce cell proliferation. They change your immune system. There's a variety of plant chemicals that reduce angiogenesis. In fact, some of our blockbuster drugs in cancer now are targeting angiogenesis, and some of the research that developed those drugs came out of a lab run by the guy by the name of William Lee, Dr. William Lee, the Angiogenesis Foundation with Harvard, and he used some of his same models to discover his drugs. He used food chemicals, and he took some, just sort of on a lark, as a measure of interest on the side, he took some food components, food chemicals, and put them in the models of angiogenesis, blood vessel growth, and found that some food chemicals dramatically impact blood vessel growth. Phytochemicals, these are things like antioxidants. They change your gene expression. They modulate cell cycles, cell death. They change your immune system. They change various enzyme systems. It goes on and on and on. There's no background of mechanisms that have been shown in animal experiments, in some human experiments, and in test tube type studies that nutrition affects cancer processes. So let's put it to the test in humans. This is where the research gets too skimpy for my taste. But there are some interesting interventions, and I'm going to talk some about animal research, which I know some people certainly, there's some ethical concerns with animal research. But from a biochemical point of view, you can certainly get information regarding basic biochemistry that you can't get in human research. This is a study looking at breast cancer in rats. So they looked at, they gave these rats a dose of DMBA. That is a chemical that causes breast cancer in breast cancer models, very commonly used in research. And then they changed their nutrition. So they divided the rats up into different groups, and they gave one group of rats cow's milk. Another group of rats, they got artificial milk. This is milk made from plant components, so it was like wheat. It was wheat protein, amino acids, supplemented oil, sugar. So it had the same kind of nutrient profile, but it was all from plants as opposed to the cow's milk. One group got straight estrogen water, which we know, of course, estrogen exposure is a risk. So they got straight estrogen. That's sort of the bad, unfortunate group of rats. And another group got water. And what you can see here, quite impressively, this line that's marked with A, that line is the amount of tumors, number of tumors in the rats who got cow's milk. And the line marked B, right next to it, that is the number of tumors in the rats that got straight estrogen exposure. So the milk exposure was as bad as straight estrogen water. And they both statistically were different from getting just water or plant milk. So that's not so good. Now we're getting into a little bit of hazardous territory. Is milk causing cancer in some of these animals? But it's not just the badness of some foods, it's also the benefit of some of the good foods. When you eat good foods or healthy foods, is that protective? Does it protect you? And this is looking at apple extract. So this was looking at sort of a whole apple extract. You're taking an apple, dehydrating it, turning it into a powder as an apple extract. This is not a single chemical in the apple. This is the whole sort of apple extract. And this was the same type of thing. In rats, they dosed them with a big carcinogen that causes breast cancer. And they gave them different levels of apple extract. One group got just a little bit of apple extract, equivalent to 1 apple a day. Now, this is 1 apple. This is sort of extrapolated to humans consuming 1 apple a day. This was not like a mini little rat-sized apple a day. This is the equivalent of like an average human eating 1 apple a day. And they found that there was lower number of tumors, 3 apples a day, a medium level of tumors, and 6 apples a day, with a high dose, a significant drop in the number of tumors by having 6 apples a day. Now, we eat many pounds of food a day. Multiple pounds of food, 3 to 5 pounds, 2 to 5 pounds, depending on how fat you're eating. You're eating maybe 4 pounds of food a day. 6 apples in the whole scheme of your dietary pattern ain't a whole lot, really. I know not many of us eat 6 apples a day, but if you count other plant foods, you can imagine how that's not a huge volume of food. This is another way of looking at that. This is apple extract and breast cancer in the same study. So that last slide was looking at the number of tumors. This looked at the overall mass, the overall tumor burden. So what you see is control on the side there that just got the high dose. The large bar, the tall bar here, is the group of rats that got the big old whopping carcinogen, and they got no apple. They just got standard chow. So big carcinogen, no apple. The second, and then you go down the line here. In the low, the bar sort of just next to the tall bar, 2.79, that's the low apple extract, so 1 apple a day. 3 apples a day is the next one, and 6 apples a day is the lowest. Now that's a pretty striking graph, I think. I showed you this in humans. This is the Pritikin Center. I showed you this part of their study, though. So let me finish the explanation of their study. This was women without breast cancer. So they did not have breast cancer, but they did this 14-day trial, and they found that all of these mechanisms, all of these intermediate factors got better in 14 days. So what they did is they took the blood samples from the women before, and they took blood samples from the same women after 14 days, and they used those blood samples to feed cancer cell lines. You can do this, you can plate out cancer cell lines, and you sort of feed it with the nutrients found in blood, in serum. That's how these cancer cell lines are grown. And what they showed is that the blood after the 14 days did not, repressed the growth of the breast cancer cell lines in an artificial environment. So the blood of these women was less cancer promoting. Or, conversely, it was more cancer fighting. It repressed the growth in several cancer cell lines. It also increased the cell death. If things are working in the body, when a cell starts going haywire, there are mechanisms for your body to kill it off. Apoptosis, programmed cell death. The cell can kill itself off. Now, if you have cancer cells, you want those things killing themselves off left and right? And apoptosis, the cancer cells actually were killing themselves off at a higher rate after 14 days of a diet and lifestyle intervention. One final little interesting study that I recently found, flaxseed muffins. So this is postmenopausal women. And what they did was these were postmenopausal women who were diagnosed with breast cancer. And when you get a biopsy-proven diagnosis of breast cancer, they do the biopsy with a needle and they get a tissue sample, basically. They get a core tissue sample of that cancer where they can make the diagnosis. So they have a tissue sample at the beginning, and then through that horrific process of the diagnosis and all those doctor visits, at some point you get the primary treatment, surgery, almost always a surgical treatment, and then you have another tissue sample. So you have a tissue sample at the beginning with diagnosis, and then you have a tissue sample at time of surgery. And what they did with these women is they kept all their diets the same, but they divided women up into two groups. And one group got flaxseed muffins. The other group got just plain muffins with no flaxseed. Everything else was the same. They didn't have to do any sort of comprehensive dietary change. And they didn't know, flaxseed muffins and the normal, everyone just got a muffin. So they didn't know. And what they found is that the flaxseed muffins, amazingly, between these two tissue samples, the women who got the flaxseed muffins, when they got the tissue sample, they did a staining for Ki69. This is a stain to look at how many cells are dividing. It's a marker of tumor proliferation. It's a marker of how much these cells are dividing. Okay, not a good thing for cancer. It's not, if you have a high Ki69, it's associated with worse prognosis. They found that eating a flaxseed muffin a day reduced the Ki69 index, the tumor cell proliferation, by a third, which was highly statistically significant. That, to me, is amazing. I don't think a flaxseed muffin would do much of anything, but it reduced cell proliferation by a third. It also increased that programmed cell death, apoptosis, by almost a third. Again, significant in both. So certainly, if you look at the scheme of research, there's a wide body of observational research that suggests environment matters, and there's also observational research linking showing diet matters. There's more than enough mechanisms to suggest how nutrition works, and we have a touch of mechanism. We need a lot more. We have a touch of intervention studies that suggest that nutrition can make a big difference in breast cancer. But not all studies agree. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into some of the large, very well done, I have to say very well done studies that show that nutrition doesn't make a big difference in diagnosed breast cancer. But let me just give you a principle. Most of the, I hope you're not getting hungry. There's food up there still. Let me take that off. I'm sorry. You're either getting hungry or sick. Most of the studies looking at nutrition and cancer, whether it's observational studies or intervention studies, are looking at relatively small changes in the diet. So there are very well done large trials looking at how nutrition might affect diagnosed breast cancer. Very nicely done. Huge, expensive, multi-center studies with like 3,000 women with breast cancer across 18 different studies. And those studies are hard to do. They're extraordinarily expensive, and they did them very well with very good methods. But the strategy they used in most of these studies is basically kind of tinkering with the diet. In some of these studies, they focus just purely on fat intake. So you can change your level of fat intake without dramatically changing your overall dietary pattern. How do you do that? You switch out, a fatty steak with a lean chicken, or in this case, a really big booger. I just don't know what that is. So this is low fat, but you're switching out a meat for a meat, right? How about this? How about switching out whole milk for skim milk? Okay? Go from cow's milk to cow's milk, but you're cutting out vast amounts of fat. And what they found in these types of studies is that tinkering with your diet, whether you're just sort of cutting down fat, or if you make some more substantial changes, in one study they did increase their fruit and vegetable consumption and so forth, but it didn't last very long, and it wasn't even significant. In a study they changed their diet, but it didn't even increase. It didn't change their weight, which seems odd to me. If you're making, I just know from my own experience, if you're making comprehensive, dramatic dietary change, weight should change if you start out overweight. At least a little bit. In these studies, there's like no weight loss. So what we've suffered from here a little bit, to go back to our original hypothesis, the original observations, is if it's true that a Western diet and lifestyle is related to breast cancer risk, if high meat, high dairy increases your breast cancer risk, what we're doing basically with these studies is we've taken Western populations and we've tinkered with their Western diet. We've switched out the high-fat meat for the baked chicken, a lot more lean meat instead of red meat. We've changed from low-fat dairy, from high-fat dairy. We've cut out the fried foods, for baked foods, that type of thing. But we haven't fundamentally changed our dietary pattern. And what we have found is that nutrition does not make a big difference. So these studies found that nutrition doesn't make a big difference in breast cancer recurrence or survival. The headlines were very depressing for people interested in nutrition because they said, increasing fruit and vegetable, decreasing fat, it don't matter. It doesn't matter. Do whatever you want to. Nutrition doesn't matter. But what we have never done, and the most promising hypothesis that has come out of the last 60 years of research, is look at what happens if you adopt a dietary pattern and lifestyle down here in the low end of the chart. So what are these traditional countries? Meat is a condiment, is a special feast, and there's no processed foods. And exercise, of course, is part of it. Exercise. And we've never tested, there hasn't been a single test in breast cancer. There hasn't been a single intervention study looking at this sort of comprehensive interventional approach to see if if diet and lifestyle might actually affect diagnosed breast cancer. From the research I've shown you, I think we can, and all, American Institute for Cancer Research, for example, a lot of traditional cancer organizations, they will admit and certainly advise, certainly encourage that diet and lifestyle plays a role in cancer prevention. But even with the animal research suggesting diet and lifestyle matters with cancer progression, even after diagnosis, we don't have the intervention research to show that that's true. Let me show you what this type of traditional sort of approach might look like. And this is what we do in our intervention programs. This is what I work with people in variable degrees with certain twists and turns with, depending on what someone brings to the encounter. But this is what I work with people in my counseling, individual office visits, and also what we encourage in our group visits. At the base is a whole food, plant-based diet. Whole foods, avoiding processed foods and food fragments. Plant foods, avoiding animal foods. And you got to get that right. You got to get that right. That's the most difficult thing to do in our culture, the food, because we live in a very toxic food environment where it's normal to eat really terribly unhealthy things. So that's very difficult. That's what we focus on. Exercise is phenomenally important. I'll mention that, but you can't run your way out of health problems, usually. You can if you take it to an extreme and you combine it with reasonable diet. But you can't outrun a bad diet, as I say. And then stress management is also important, so you can better take care of yourself. These are a whole food plant-based diet. Just very quickly, I have 3 food groups: animal, anything from an animal, of an animal, meat, dairy, and eggs; whole plants, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, starchy vegetables. So things like potatoes, beans, whole grains, the things that people are deathly afraid of. Refined plants, these are things like food fragments. So you take white sugar, white flours, oils. These are just fragments of the original plant. And you've taken all the rest of the plant and you've thrown it away, or you've turned it into pet food or something else. Usually it goes to like pet food and rabbits. And the rabbits get the good stuff when we get screwed. The American diet looks like this: mac and cheese, pizza, burgers, steak and potatoes, whatever, you name it. Animal source foods and refined plants. I have to tell you, actually, probably one of the biggest offenders in the American diet is actually processed foods. It's not even the animal foods. It's probably, from a bulk sort of calorie point of view, it's actually probably processed foods. It's the sugars and the oils and the refined grains. Very few whole plants, fruits and vegetables, as far as overall calorie intake. So where do we need to go? We need to change this on its head. We need to flip this around. And this is going to get back to that part of the chart that has never been tested but has the most promise. And good reasons to think this is going to make a difference for cancer. This type of diet. What does this look like? This is a terrible picture of a breakfast. I don't have a lot of pictures of my food. I'm not one of those people. This is a terrible picture from a breakfast I had at a conference. It was just so delicious, and I was like sitting there so pleased with my breakfast, I had to take a picture. And it was at one of these plant-based conferences, so everything was like no added fat, all plant-based. So you're looking at a tofu scramble mixed in there, that's the yellow, a potato scramble with spices, a nice salsa with it, a huge bunch of mixed fruit, and then underneath there's some pancakes made in a healthy way, whole grains, no added fat. Good food, pleasurable. I was like, There's also Kitchen Verde. You've had some food here, and we have a very fortunate opportunity in this community to have Kitchen Verde because you can get this food. This is pictures that loaned from Kitchen Verde from Sarah. This is a stuffed pepper that they make. This is another meal, chickpeas, some nice flavorings on here, beets, sweet potatoes, cauliflower, asparagus. How about a pizza made a little differently, but a whole grain pizza crust? Homemade marinara sauce and a whole bunch of grilled vegetables on that. A lot of folks in our groups, we talk to them about this type of pizza, and it becomes kind of a standby. It's very easy. This is at our immersion program over the summer. We have these very fancy, all-inclusive sort of one-week things at the Woodcliff Hotel, and they do these special buffets, and we have these layouts like this with salads, tons of fruits, and we have something always warm and starchy and satisfying. Potatoes, there's some seitan mixed in there, some wheat protein, there's rice and beans and sauce, and then some sides. Very, very good. So I focused on breast cancer. I want to just make a quick note about there is one study, well-done study, published looking at this type of comprehensive dietary approach to diagnosed cancer patients. There is one study, and that's prostate cancer. And I'm not going to go through all the charts, but this is Dean Ornish, who many of you know from heart disease, and many of you have heard of his prostate cancer study. He took men with early-stage prostate cancer, so they were early-stage, slow-growing cancer. They could do watchful waiting with no intervention, no drugs, no surgery. They just did watchful waiting with frequent follow-up to make once the cancer shows signs of progression, you can do some intervention. But until then, you can sort of watch it without the side effects and morbidity of the interventions. And he put them on basically the Dean Ornish Heart Disease Reversal Program, essentially. All vegan, entirely, strictly plant-based, whole food. There were some supplements. I think he supplemented with some soy protein and some selenium, other supplements, but whole food, plant-based diet. No dairy, no meat. He did some stress reduction, mindfulness, kind of meditation, and he did group support. That's what his heart disease reversal program. It's the same program that's been shown to reverse heart disease, which is a sentence that's impressive enough as it is. And so what happened after 1 year of this, the men in the low-fat plant-based diet and lifestyle arm, they demonstrated a reduction in their PSA levels. So their PSA, that's a marker of prostate cancer. On average, their PSA levels went down. The control group got worse. After a couple of years, more of the control group went on to require intervention. And the experimental group, very few of them required intervention within 2 years. Some small number did, but very few. And he showed a lot of ancillary studies. He showed that in the men with the comprehensive changes, their gene expression changed in a way that was favorable for cancer, or unfavorable for cancer progression. So anti-cancer genes were turned up, were upregulated, Pro-cancer genes were turned down. A lot of different interesting findings. So for men with prostate cancer, this was a randomized controlled trial published in the Journal of Urology. It's one of the most common cancers we have in our culture. We have evidence that going down to that part of that line graph with a comprehensive diet and lifestyle approach can actually change the course of cancer even after diagnosis. I want to mention two other things. Let me just say before I mention the other things, we do not have this data. It has never been studied for breast cancer, for ovarian cancer, for any other types of cancer. So I am left as a conservative, cautious doctor saying we don't really know for sure. We don't know if this type of approach will help diagnose breast cancer. Is there a point at which there's no return? Are there certain types of breast cancer or certain types of other cancers that are more affected by diet? We don't know that. We don't know, unfortunately. I want to mention three other things that are incredibly important. One is exercise. Exercise is phenomenal. Like I said, you cannot outrun a bad diet, but I have been consistently impressed with how beneficial exercise is for overall health. And with cancer in particular, a lot of people are not aware of the exercise-cancer connection. But this was a study looking at exercise after diagnosis, post-diagnosis physical activity. So after diagnosis of breast cancer, how much women exercise. The women who exercise the most have a 34% reduction in death from breast cancer. This is on par with some of our best medications. Very impressive, very impressive. And we know that how exercise works. And this is true not only for breast cancer, but also colon cancer. The same type of data has been shown. Alcohol. Now, this is something that people sometimes are absolutely unwilling to entertain, but alcohol is not good for cancer. Alcohol is not good for cancer. And breast cancer, again, staying with the breast cancer theme, alcohol, it's one of those outcomes which we say there is no lower threshold at which alcohol has been shown to be safe. There is no lower threshold. In one study, even half a drink a day in patients with diagnosed and treated early breast cancer increases breast cancer recurrence by a third. This is an observational study. It increases breast cancer recurrence by a third and breast cancer death by 51%. That's kind of wild. We know that alcohol consumed in high amounts, in excessive amounts, is linked to cancer just about everywhere in the body it touches. Your mouth, your throat, maybe your stomach. It gets digested, certainly cancer in the liver, cancer in the large intestine, colorectal cancer, and also breast cancer, as I mentioned. And we know how this works. It's not just random observations. We know how alcohol can be digested and it forms carcinogen byproducts. We also know, in the case of breast cancer, that it operates through hormone system pathways. It can change hormones. So this is not sort of odd random observations. It's backed up by known mechanisms. So alcohol is very good. One other thing I don't have a slide for that it's just caught my mind, I was talking with the graduates here before the lecture, is sun exposure. This is a surprising thing to many people. Sun exposure, as you may know, is linked to vitamin D, right? When you go out in the sun, even when it's cloudy, it doesn't have to be direct, or even believe it or not, when you're in the shade, there's enough reflected UV radiation from the sun when you're outside that you get, when it hits your skin, you make vitamin D. And vitamin D has been sort of the super nutrient, the miracle drug of the nutrition world for the past 15, 20 years. It's been found people with higher levels of vitamin D have a lower risk of many different types of cancer. They have lower risks of multiple sclerosis and many other conditions. And it seems that there's something very, very nice about having an adequate vitamin D level, aka sun exposure. And there was a study done in Scandinavia following something like 30,000 people for a long time. I think it was like 20 years. And they divided these people up into sun avoiders, moderate sun, and more sun exposure. And the people who had the most, who were sun avoiders, the people who had the least sun exposure, had twice the risk of death compared to the people who had the most sun. Now, that's an observational study, so you can't say much for sure, but they said this observation is as strong as, avoiding sun is as bad as smoking, if you just look at the observation numbers, which is a crazy, crazy idea. Burning is terrible. Burning will increase your risk of melanoma. Do not burn. But moderate sun exposure in the middle of the day from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. has been linked with good outcomes. In fact, even melanoma, believe it or not, outdoor workers, did you know outdoor workers, people with a lot more exposure to the sun, have a lower risk of melanoma than indoor workers? That's been shown many times. Moderate sun exposure actually has a protective effect, and it's been shown now in animal experiments in cancer, in colorectal cancer. Believe it or not, in animal experiments, in rats growing colorectal cancer, you can give them some UV radiation, you can give them some vitamin D. There's something special about that sunlight. So go outside regularly, get some fresh air, take some deep breaths while you're out there, right in the middle of the day when you're most stressed, and your day is going to get a lot better, and you're going to lower your risk of disease, it turns out. But do not burn. Treatment decisions, this is my last comment, and then we'll do Q&A. Treatment decisions, I have to say, again, being a conservative, cautious doctor, I don't want patients to turn their back on any option they have. And so I always tell people that you should make treatment decisions irrespective of your nutritional choices. If you get a diagnosis of cancer recurrence, you should make leave the nutrition at the door for the moment, when you're with your doctor, and make treatment decisions irrespective of the diet, because we don't know. We haven't done the research. We don't know for sure. There's abundant research to suggest that diet is likely to make an enormous impact. But I've talked to people who hear this, they get so excited that they abandon all traditional treatment and they just eat fruits and vegetables, and I don't like that. I have to say I don't like that. So there's a lot of reasons why you would have traditional treatment or why you wouldn't have traditional treatment, chemo, surgery, that type of thing. Make those decisions separately from your nutrition decisions. After you make those decisions, though, I think there's enough evidence to be 100% full steam ahead with optimal nutrition. I think it's more likely than it's been studied and shown, and it's absolutely crucial to pay attention to your diet. I think it's absolutely crucial. And one final note, to fill this gaping hole in the scientific literature, we've actually raised funding here at the University of Rochester, the Program for Nutrition and Medicine. We've raised significant amount of funding to do a pilot project with women with advanced breast cancer to do a comprehensive dietary change and see what happens in a pilot project. So symptoms and biomarkers and try to fill this gap. It'll be the first study, in my knowledge, ever done in history looking at comprehensive diet and lifestyle changes in metastatic cancer. So, questions? I know there's some actually were emailed to me that if they don't come up, I'll mention, but let's.
Regarding the half glass of wine every day with dinner, what specifically is wrong with the alcohol? Is it the sugar? Is it the fermented grapes? Do they know?
No, I think it's actually the alcohol has an effect on some of the estrogen pathways, and I don't know the biochemistry well enough, but it does impact sort of the hormone activity in the breast cancer cells. I don't want to give you too much the wrong information to get more detailed, but it's something about the alcohol itself, not the sugar, the alcohol itself.
Isn't the nursing therapy kind of a study of nutrition?
Yeah, so a question about the Gerson therapy, a study of nutrition. It is, yeah, and that's the one other study looking at patients with melanoma. It's more of a case series, though. It's not really there's no control group. It was a case series, and there was no comparison group of patients. It was a very nice paper, and it lends weight to this idea. But patients who go to the Gerson clinic in Mexico, and they went on a lacto-ovo vegetarian diet, so they had a little bit of dairy, but mostly vegetarian diet, and they did a whole bunch of supplements and other sort of special alternative things. And they found that these melanoma patients, particularly early melanoma, they had a lower rate of death than would be expected in standard populations. So that's a very interesting research that kind of lends weight to the idea that there's something here, but it's not nearly as rigidly done, in my opinion, as like the Ornish style in prostate cancer. All the way in the back.
Is there any research or any information concerning the effects of nutrition on estrogen and progesterone negative cancers versus ER and positive?
Yeah, the question is types of cancer, like is there research specific to hormone receptor negative breast cancer? And there are some of these observational studies looking at diet and lifestyle, they do find that, some of the benefit seems to be surprisingly disproportionately among women with estrogen receptor negative, with hormone receptor negative breast cancer. So it seems in some of these observational studies that hormone receptor negative breast cancer actually does respond. It's associated with improved diet and lifestyle habits, and there's some mechanisms that are common, mechanisms of inflammation, metabolic syndrome, the insulin stuff, the growth factors, IGF-1. There's a lot of mechanisms outside of the sort of hormone pathway that may explain some of those effects. So on different types of cancer, not just the hormone sensitive cancers.
One of my biggest issues as a practitioner is compliance, and I've had patients particularly recently that are very picky and very stubborn. So do you have any, it's true.
Yeah, I know.
If you have someone who really needs to change their diet, do you have any tips or tricks or persuasive mechanisms you use?
So questions about how to help people change their diets. That's a very, very difficult topic, and I've had two lives. One was as a standard family physician, which I just ended this past summer, and I was seeing people who had no particular knowledge or awareness that I was this food guy. So they wanted just their meds refilled, and they got their diagnosis from XYZ, and I was counseling them, right? And so it was a very normal group of people. And then I see people now who are very motivated to come in. They've crossed the biggest hurdle, which is to make the appointment, and they know they're coming to talk to me about this. So that's sort of an abnormal group of people. And the normal group of people is very difficult, particularly in our current environment where we don't have enough time, we don't have resources, there's no educational materials, and there's no colleague support for dietary interventions. So oftentimes, even making moderate changes, I was one of the only people who had ever told somebody that they need to change their diet, even in a moderate way. And so that's very hard if someone's going and seeing the specialist who's an expert in XYZ, or and they're not getting the same message. And so it's easy to say, oh, that guy, it's like one of those magazines at the checkout counter, like I'll smile and nod and forget him. So I certainly had that experience, but you just keep on trucking. And what do you do? Are you? So you're a dietitian. So people, you're somewhere in between. Getting people to see a dietitian. There's a lot of that normal group of people will not see a dietitian. And so if you have someone who is interested in seeing a dietitian, they're at least interested to hear about nutrition. And at that point, it's a matter of motivational interviewing and the kinds of things that I'm sure you've learned. It's really about helping people reach their own goals, figure out their own goals. You have to educate. But motivational interviewing is not the end-all, be-all. I don't want to go on a you guys are all like, what are you talking about? It's not the end-all, be-all because, in my opinion, motivational interviewing is very patient-focused, and you're sort of letting patients define their own goals and then reach their own goals, and you're doing it in a supportive way. That's great if the patient knows where they're going and why, where to go and why. And you have to have some direction. You have to give direction in a sort of an authoritative way. And you kind of merge that education with the spirit of motivational interviewing. That's kind of my approach to that. So it's a long conversation, but it is that behavior change, I think, is actually the holy grail of medicine. I think that we have missed the boat totally. And we've put all our effort into developing pills and procedures, but you know what? A lot of people don't even take the pills and procedures. So even in the standard medical model, behavior change is poorly addressed. Poorly addressed. I think it was with ground flaxseed, with 25 grams of ground flaxseed. I don't know what else was in them. Obviously, they weren't just flaxseed cakes. I assume just some whole grain flaxseed. Correct. Yes. So flaxseed, if you consume a whole flaxseed, it can help with constipation because it passes through, but it won't be digested very well, if at all. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, chia seeds, I'm not aware of any specific role with chia seeds. Chia seeds are very high in omega-3 fats. I just saw a video with Dr. Greger yesterday or something about chia versus flax. and apparently the fats in chia seeds the fats in chia seeds are more absorbable if they too are ground, but I've never seen ground chia anywhere. So flax also has lignans, and chia does not have lignans, those things I mentioned as being good. So maybe ground flax is better, but now we're talking really reductionist. I wouldn't get too worked up about either. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's different definitions of processing. It actually gets very complicated. Frozen food is actually a form of processing. It's sort of lightly processed, right? Because you're not eating it like from the dirt. But tofu, of course, is processed, and have you guys made tofu? I'm sure nobody here? You're not raising your hand because I'm going to pick on you? So anyway, you're throwing out a lot of stuff in that tofu. I mean, some of that fiber, all that fiber is being thrown out. You're left with protein and fat, but you're throwing out a lot of the stuff that's in the whole soybean. So it is processed, but then again, plain tofu, I'm not against plain tofu. So that was related to one of the questions that was emailed to me was soy. That's a perpetual area of confusion, particularly in breast cancer and hormone-sensitive cancers. And the research has been pretty compelling that soy is linked to improved outcomes. Increasing soy is associated with improved outcomes in these hormone-sensitive cancers. So either improved outcomes or no change in outcomes. So it's either non-harmful, we call, or it's beneficial. And that's true even of women who are on hormone-modulating therapies, tamoxifen, Arimidex, anastrozole, letrozole. That's even women on those medicines. It seems that soy consumption does not have a harmful effect and may even be beneficial. So soy, I think, is fine. Consume soy, a little bit of plain tofu. I do get a little bit nervous when people are doing, tofu everything, because it is processed. You do lose the fiber. They're doing tofu every day, and they're doing huge glasses of soy milk 3 times a day. I mean, it's too much. It's too much. So eat the soybean, eat some tempeh, have some plain tofu, but leave off the soy protein powders, the soy oils, and tofu should be kind of a nice flavoring condiment. You should not be having scrambled tofu every day with like a tofu sandwich for lunch.
Trying to see if there's some practical application to that apple situation.
Yeah.
why the apple? I mean, of course, the old adage and whatnot, but is there like apple substitutes for apple, general fruits? You know?
Yeah, good question. There's a question about the apple. Great question. So that research was done at Cornell University, and it was done, I think, because they had just been studying the antioxidant capacity of different fruits and vegetables. So they actually had published a lot of other research looking at antioxidant capacity, for example, of apple peel. You know, apple peel versus whole apple versus flesh of an apple, that type of thing. So they'd been doing this research, in-depth research on apples. So I think they use that, their methods of just creating an apple extract. You know, they had those sort of methods down, and so they used that in the cancer study. There's nothing, I don't think, particularly amazing or unique about the apple. All fruit has an abundant array of antioxidants, thousands of chemicals that we cannot even describe. We don't even have names for all of these phytochemicals, and we haven't even identified all of them, and for goodness sake, we don't know what all of them do in all the situations in the body. And so, you know, to make that a little more practical, 25% of your calories from apples, you could try that, I suppose, but you'd get pretty sick of apples. Apples are delicious, I think. Which, as a side, let me say, I saw a great internet meme the other day, and it says, if you're hungry, eat an apple, and if you don't want the apple, you're not hungry, you're bored. Step away from the food. So anyway, to get back to the question, you know, if you're going to have an array of phytochemicals, an array of antioxidants, an array of cancer protective compounds, you might think 25% of your calories from non-starchy vegetables and fruits. So, you know, a big, huge salad with fruits. Yeah. So, you know, the study was not looking at a fruit and vegetable blend, but I think from a practical point of view, you can be comfortable that if the whole apple and all of those thousands of phytochemicals had some cancer-fighting effect, it's likely to be true for other plant foods as well. Yeah, an apple a day will not keep the doctor away. 6 apples a day, maybe 12 apples a day. All the way in the back.
I have just a comment and follow up to the apple conversation. I'm a juicer, and one of my best juices, which is easy to make, is an apple juice, and I use 3 apples. Mostly Granny Smith, but sometimes I mix it in red, and it makes a nice sized glass of juice. And it's easy to drink down, and I've got 3 apples. I also add other things to it that other people might or might not want to do. I add a piece of ginger, a piece of turmeric root, some garlic, fresh garlic, and a wedge of lemon, all organic.
What happens to the, so the comment is about the ease of juicing. What happens to the peel when you juice?
The only thing I remove from the apple are the seeds on the inside, because I read somewhere that they contain, I don't know if it's some, arsenic.
Uh-huh.
And I also remove the stem and then that little furry thing. Otherwise, everything else goes in.
And does the juicer, is it a juicer or a mixer?
No, it's a juicer.
It's a juicer, so you get some pulp.
It's an omega juicer.
You get a pulp sort of taken out?
Very little pulp, and after you're done making the juice, and you drink the juice, you can pull the pulp out and eat that.
Right.
Sweet.
It's interesting, in the Gerson therapy, they also use juicing, and there's sort of a carrot juice mixture that you'll find. I'm sure you can, people looking at this on the internet probably, you know, carrot juice. You know, you can add a variety of things, and you can get a lot of antioxidants that way. I mean, you can drink a lot of carrot juice and get a lot of carotene and turn orange, and you know, get a lot of exposure to good things that way. And I think relative to other food choices, I think this can be really easy and nice for people and very easy to do. My only caveat would be that when you juice things, you are removing some of the pulp, some of the fiber, and you're putting it in a form that is more readily and quickly digested, so that, you know, some of those things like the phytochemicals may actually be better absorbed and faster absorbed but so might the sugar be as well. The sugar also might be, and it likely is, based on research, it likely is. So I prefer people eat 3 apples, but in the optimal, but I appreciate your comment. All the way over here in the back. Yeah, cooking. So there's been some concern certainly from Teflon, and many of you have heard of the nonstick sort of Teflon cookware. And that was born as part of the effect, this dramatic effect that if you heat up a Teflon pan to very high degrees in a closed environment, if you have pet birds, you might kill them because there's some chemical that kills that was toxic to birds. So everybody naturally could instantly think, oh my God, I was killing that bird. I'm not eating off that thing. Nonstick now has evolved, I think, past that. So if you go to Target now, you can find cheap, sort of high-quality ceramic nonstick, which is more inert. And you can get a nice stir-fry pan, large, for $20. That's ceramic nonstick. And so we have one of those, and I recommend that. It's real easy to use that now.
Have you successfully worked with persons that have Crohn's disease? I'm thinking of a particular loved one in my life who does not have any large colon. And so from 25 years ago when he first had the surgery, he was always told to stay away from fiber, which of course he didn't do. He finds certain fibers he can digest and will come through easier, and others not. Would this plant-based diet be something that would be advisable?
So, question about someone with their colon removed due to Crohn's disease and whether dietary change, and that's a very difficult discussion because people with Crohn's sometimes absolutely cannot tolerate high fiber. Things like beans can set off, significant symptoms and problems with Crohn's, and so it does have to be tailored. And there's certainly people with Crohn's, based on their experience, where I have not recommended a strict whole food plant-based diet, not even close, because I know that some of their foods will cause problems. There hasn't been, you'd think with something like Crohn's, and this is true basically also of all patients who have had major GI surgery. So people with their large colons or some large part of their large colons removed, I think our dietitians in our system have a lot of experience with that and dealing with post-surgical issues, and I would refer to them, and I would not push a high fiber diet because sometimes without that natural method, those natural ways of dealing with food, you've created a very unnatural situation, and the sort of whole food plant-based diet may not be the right way to go. I will say with Crohn's disease in general, someone who hasn't had their colon removed, there was a very small study. I don't think it was like the most convincing sort of rigorous kind of trial. There's surprisingly little research. You'd think bowel disease, there would be a ton of nutrition research. Not really. Not in interventions. There's not nearly enough, but there was one study looking at people, they were recommended to eat, it was in Japan, fermented foods, and they were started on a low fiber sort of white rice and then moved into brown rice and vegetables, and it was a vegetarian diet, some dairy, and fish, and they found that the people who adhered to the diet had a much lower rate of relapse with Crohn's disease. So it actually ended up being kind of a high fiber, high roughage kind of diet once they acclimated them to it, and they did much better with it. But someone who doesn't have their large intestine, that's going to be a very specific, unique circumstance. Okay.
I work with a number of people who identify as transgender, and so as part of their transition process, and they start these gender-affirming hormones, they're taking estrogen, they're taking testosterone. Listening to this, is this potentially going to increase the risk of cancer for some of these folks when you're taking these supplements?
Yeah, the hormone with the gender, the transgender patients who are changing gender, they are come with serious side effects. Serious side effects. It's not only potentially cancer, but also cardiovascular side effects, blood clots, potentially serious or fatal blood clots and hormones. This is why it's very interesting if you look at women around the time of menopause. Of course, 20 years ago, hormone replacement therapy was very common. I mean, it was like you reach that time, take the hormone replacement, and everything. It helps with a lot of symptoms. And the Women's Health Initiative was started to see what effect that hormone replacement was having, and they studied this in a bigger study than you could ever devise. I mean, this was like this is $1 billion plus study. We'll never have better data than this study. And they found that the hormone replacement was increasing risk of breast cancer, increasing risk of clots, increasing risk, surprisingly, opposite of what they thought, increasing risk of other cardiovascular disease, stroke, blood clots, breast cancer. And so that news came out, and prescriptions of hormone replacement therapy, fell off a cliff. Now, sometimes it still may be indicated depending on quality of life, and that's a separate conversation to have with your doctor, but it's no longer used routinely because of the risks of hormone exposure and hormone medication, and documented very well now. So certainly, those medications come with very serious side effects. Yeah.
You mentioned sun exposure or vitamin D. With the vitamin D replacement, would still be beneficial from the benefits of
Yeah, it's a great question. Does vitamin D supplementation support or replace sunshine exposure? And I don't know that we know. If you look at, in my answer based on the evidence I've seen is that no, it does not replace the sun. Vitamin D supplementation is important to prevent deficiency. In this part of the country, there's a lot of deficiency. So, people go 6 months with no sun in the middle of the day, no sun exposure in the middle of the day. And, if you can have frank deficiency of vitamin D. I mean, I've seen a kid with rickets. I've seen, adults can have osteomyelitis. These do happen. So taking a low dose vitamin D, I think, is very reasonable. But that's not going to replace the sun exposure. In this review paper I recently saw, there was an interesting animal experiment looking at rats and colon cancer. So these were rats who are a colon cancer model. These are rat models that are bred to have risks, factors, or genes, or develop colon cancer. And they gave these rats either nothing. They gave them a vitamin D deficient diet. Okay, all the rats got a vitamin D deficient diet. One group got no supplemental vitamin D. They just had a low vitamin D diet. That was the control. The other group got vitamin D supplementation, and the other group got UV radiation to naturally, mimic the sun and create vitamin D naturally. And what they found was that the vitamin D group did better than the control group in terms of colon cancer, the proliferation and division, and the nastiness of these cells, the look of these cells, the differentiation, this type of thing. The vitamin D supplemented group did do better than the non-supplemented, the deficient group. But they didn't do, in some ways, they didn't do as well as the radiation group. The radiation group seemed to have something more than just the vitamin D supplementation group. And there's some other evidence, I think, to support that idea that there's something probably more to this idea of getting in the sun. And for chronic disease in particular, we've studied vitamin D supplementation. If you're not deficient, so let's say you have a normal level, low normal, even low normal level. If you're not deficient, there have been so many studies looking at vitamin D supplementation. So if you have a low normal vitamin D and you have multiple sclerosis, which is time and time again be linked to low vitamin D status, if you supplement those people with vitamin D to bring their vitamin D level up, no benefit. No benefit. So for chronic disease, going from a low normal level to a high level to a super high level, there's really very poor evidence, no evidence, to show that really helps chronic disease. So for this cancer discussion, I really have to say it's more probably about getting out in the sun. with a caveat that in this part of the country we do actually have some deficiency problems, some frank deficiency. So taking a small supplement is very reasonable, especially in the summer, but getting out in the sun is the important thing. And take some nice deep breaths while you're out there, because breathing is also very good, but I don't have science on that. Yeah, sunscreen, just to make that very specific. So the sunscreen thing, sunscreen blocks vitamin D conversion in the body. So you don't make vitamin D when you're wearing sunscreen, the parts of your skin where you have applied sunscreen. So go out for 15 minutes before you apply sunscreen without any blockage and get some natural rays. In fact, they've actually found that the sunlight hitting your skin has a chemical reaction that hits some of the endorphin centers in your brain. It's almost addictive. You're just, it's pleasurable. And we all have that feeling, right? All of you guys are going to leave and you're going to realize how much nicer it is out there than you were in here when that sun hits your face. I had a quick question that was emailed about sugar and cancer. This has been a very, very hot topic, and I will quickly address it. There is some evidence that refined sugar is bad for cancer. In animal experiments, they've shown that some cancer risk goes up with higher sugar diets. And so certainly I'm against sugar as well. I do think it's become a little bit of a distraction in some ways, that like everything under the sun is due to sugar, and it's much more than just sugar. It's your whole dietary pattern. Are you eating a lot of refined grains? Are you having a lot of added fats? Are you, having a lot of cheeses? Are you eating a lot of meat? Are you eating fruits and vegetables? All of these things matter. It's not all just about sugar, but avoiding added sugar is a very good idea. So my opinion with regard to cancer, they've done, actually my dad was on an expert panel looking for the National Academy of Sciences, looking at one of the early sugar substitutes, the early common sugar substitute in cancer risk. And basically it's very hard to say whether there's any cancer risk to those things. It's likely to be pretty insignificant to that level of exposure to artificial sweeteners. But there's some interesting research on artificial sweeteners on gut health and insulin sensitivity and other metabolic factors these things are bad. Artificial sweeteners are bad. They also will trigger your sweet cravings. So cravings for sweetness and sugar addiction and that type of thing. Artificial sweeteners are going to do no good for you in that regard. So I advise people to avoid artificial sweeteners just like they avoid sugar, added sugar. So anyway, thank you all for coming. What a wonderful group. And